now for our introduction of our keynote speaker. Just making sure he's ready. So I'm really pleased to introduce to you Mark Harrington. I think many of you are familiar and know Mark well. For those of you who don't, Mark Harrington's advocacy career spans nearly 3 decades and started in 1988 when Mark joined the seminal AIDS activist group ACT UP, which stands for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power in New York, 5 years after receiving his bachelor degree from Harvard University. As a member of ACT UP's Treatment and Data Committee, Mark helped plan and execute a number of effective demonstrations that helped to initiate fundamental shifts in how the US FDA and the US NIH and other government agencies address the emergency posed by the HIV pandemic in the United States. In 1992, Mark co-founded the Treatment Action Group with a group of treatment and data committee members to form a long-term nonprofit, non-governmental organization dedicated to advocating for research, treatment, prevention, and cure of HIV and AIDS. In 2000, TAG expanded its work to focus on leading co-infections killing people with HIV around the world, which includes, as you know, tuberculosis and hepatitis C infection. And since 2002, Mark has been the executive director of TAG. He's also served as the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services panel on antiretroviral guidelines for adults and adolescents, and was a member of the writing group that produced the updated WHO guidelines for antiretroviral therapy and HIV infection in resource-limited settings. He is also a member of numerous advisory groups, too numerous for me to go through, but the important one is that he has been one of our earliest members of the advisory group for the Critical Path to TB Drug Regimens initiative. We thought it was really important in this 8th year to kick off with a keynote focused on sharing perspectives of an advocate. And also we'll be hearing later in the session from TB survivors as well. So with that, Mark.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to speak here. I would like to add my words of thanks and praise to Jan, and it's been a pleasure working with you ever since I believe I met you at the union meeting in Cape Town in 2007. And so at that point, the Critical Path was just being conceived, but it's really been a pleasure working with you over the years and seeing as your vision moves forward and how much we've all been able to gain from it. I'm gonna do a show and tell. Can you guys see this? It's part of a regimen. Can you see this? This is an integrase inhibitor called dolutegravir. It was approved by the FDA in 2014, and it's part of my antiretroviral regimen. And this drug, which is almost too small to see, is called Descovy. It was approved last year, and it's a drug from Gilead that includes 2 drugs, TAF and FTC. And so I'm able to take a new regimen for my HIV treatment, all of which includes drugs that were only approved in the last 3 years. And so that's just a way of showing that this idea of regimen development is not just something that we think is important here in tuberculosis. It's driven enormous innovation, is keeping millions of people alive around the world with HIV, and it's increasingly being used in other infectious disease areas like hepatitis, where over 5 combinations have been approved just in the last 3 years alone. So our field is not as richly funded, as you all know, as hepatitis research or HIV research, and the reason is largely because those diseases affect people in both the rich and the poor world, and most people affected by TB live in actually middle-income countries, which do far too little to invest in their own health and in their own epidemics. And I'm going to come back to the issue of research funding in a few minutes, but I'll just note that we're in the most vulnerable place for research funding that we've ever been because of the political situation here in the United States. And we've got this weird situation where the US has been the leading funder of global health for many, many years. And that political support for that has usually been pretty strong, but is amazingly fragile right now in the new administration and the newly proposed budget for the National Institutes of Health includes a 20% cut, which would be devastating for everybody, not just for us. So the U.S. is the biggest funder of TB R&D, but the second biggest funder is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I don't think I'd be exaggerating to say that we wouldn't, not only would we not be here having this meeting, but we also wouldn't be this far along in TB R&D if it wasn't for their joint efforts. But I do have to say that last year in the TAG TB R&D report, which we've been doing since 2006, we noticed that global funding for TB research and development had fallen to about $620 million, which was its lowest level since the year before the CPTR was founded, or 2008. And what the last decade really described was that there was sort of 5 years of an increase from the launch of the second global plan to stop TB between 2005 and 2008, 9, and 10, and then it kind of stabilized out, and then it sort of began to fall, and it's been falling. It's fallen a couple other times, but this was the lowest level since 2008. And the mix of investments have also changed. So when this group started, there was a lot more investment by the larger pharmaceutical companies. So for example, Pfizer was in the TB R&D game. AstraZeneca was involved in TB R&D. Some of the sponsors are beginning to come back in. I believe I heard a rumor that Merck was going to be here at this meeting, and that's good, and we welcome them. I have to say, coming from the HIV side, having pharma as a partner really has been essential to the progress in HIV, and a lot of the compounds, despite the massive investment in basic science that was made by the NIH, a lot of the compounds were wholly discovered and developed in-house by the pharmaceutical companies. And so we need their involvement. We need to think about in skillful ways about how to bring them back if they're not here. And one way that I think that we really can talk about investment and return on investment with pharma is to talk about the new Stop TB, NTB strategy, which includes as one of its key elements is preventive therapy. And the preventive therapy market for HIV compounds, which might well be combination compounds like we use in HIV. So we use Truvada for pre-exposure prophylaxis, and that's a two-drug combination. Over the last 10 years, we've seen approval by the FDA of a new two-drug combination for the prevention of tuberculosis. That is rifapentine and isoniazid taken once a week for 12 weeks. And so whenever people say that the market isn't big enough for TB, I always tell them about the 2.5 billion people that are infected by TB and how the TB prevention is going to be an essential part of getting new cases down to below the threshold where TB will continue to be a public health threat. That doesn't mean we also don't need a vaccine and shorter acting cures, but we do, but I think it's a missing piece in the R&D agenda, or until recently it's been a missing piece. So pharma's only investing about $87 million a year in TB R&D, and that's really not enough for a well-functioning phase 1 program, let alone a phase 1, 2, and 3 program. And overall, the investment that was made in TB R&D over the decade covered by the second global plan was supposed to be about $10 billion, but it was only $3.3 billion. And so the global leaders that endorsed that plan in 2005 failed to meet on their promises. And so just looking at the drug field for 2011 to 2015, the plan called for $810 million over those 5 years. I'm sorry, it called for $810 million in 2015 and $3.7 billion over the 5-year period. But in 2015, rather than getting $810 million, funders only gave $232 million to TB drug development. So again, probably the size of a decent phase 2 program. And we can actually calibrate the numbers for these TB programs because we have a Tsuka data for every single year that they've had delaminated in development, and they were at one time the largest funder of TB R&D, including in the drug space, including Gates and NIH. But their funding has fallen by about half as they are now wrapping up their phase 3 development program. So let's talk about the drugs that were in the pipeline when this group was founded. So there were 5 drugs in the TAG pipeline report at that point that were new. There was TMC 207, there was delaminid, there was PA824, there was SQ109 from Sequela, and then there was a PNU compound, which later turned out to be cetazolid. And they were all in phase 2 or 3 or 1. So in the 2016 TAG pipeline, what were the drugs that were listed as being in phase 1 to 3? There was bedaquiline, there was delaminid, there was pretomanid, and there was cetazolid. So one big progress that happened between 2008 and 2016 was that drugs got generic names, which, you know, is a good thing. And they also advanced from 1 or 2 to 2A to 3. And then we have a few new drugs. There's a follow-up compound from Otsuka. There is a compound from Curient called Q203, and then there's another compound called PBTZ169. And I'm sure Mel could talk about other things that are going to enter phase 1. But overall, what you see is a pretty static, slow-moving, kind of like a glacier made out of molasses or something field, where you don't have a lot of forward development. And of course, CPTR is about whole regimens and not just drugs, but you can't make regimens without new drugs. And I mentioned the new regimen that I'm on, and all the elements in it, except for one part of the TAF pill, were developed in the last 4 years. But the pipeline for them and the other combination regimens that were approved in the last 8 years, you know, goes back for the whole 25 years of sort of the modern era of ARV drug development. Now, I don't want to be too depressing or depressed about the progress that we've made with the resources that we've got. I'm impressed that actually we have made progress in spite of being grossly underfunded. And so I think one of the biggest advances was molecular diagnosis with the GeneXpert, which was launched in 2010. Something that's often not noted is that the NIH funding for TB clinical trials grew a lot beginning in 2011 with the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, TB Transformative Sciences Group, and that is now the largest group of TB trials in the world. And they have to do everything from soup to nuts, so they have to do everything from like phase 1 to kind of early phase combo studies to really large phase 3 trials, like a trial we're going to launch later this year of delaminid versus INH for the prevention of MDR-TB among household contacts of people with MDR-TB. And that, I have to take my hat off to Otsuka for being willing to contribute drug for that study. That's an example of the kind of innovative thinking that we need in the TB space to get more sponsors out. And then, of course, in 2012, the FDA approved bedaquiline. Just want to point out it took 4 years between the time the drug was approved for the phase 3 study to be launched. And that was a gross oversight by the FDA to allow them to take that long to launch their phase 3 study. And then they outsourced the development of it to USAID, which led to further delays. In 2014, the European Medicines Association provided a conditional recommendation for approval for delaminid based, again, on a phase 2 study, but at least Otsuka actually had a phase 3 study that was enrolling at the time. And also because the EMA has more stringent requirements about kids, they have been doing pediatric studies and in fact are now down at the lowest age cohort, so they're at the 1 to 2, 0 to 2. And once we have the data from that age band, one of the things that's exciting about the Phoenix study is it's going to enroll people from the age of 0 to up to as long as they're still able to walk and enroll in the study. So it's going to be one of the first studies that's going to be enrolled to people of any age who are at risk for MDR-TB, and so that means that the results will be very generalizable. I already mentioned the 3-HP regimen, rifapentine and INH, but it was approved by the FDA in 2014. The WHO recommended the use of a urine dipstick called LAM in 2015 for hospitalized people with advanced HIV disease with very low CD4 counts who were debilitated, and it's a true point of care test, and it's actually proved to help survival because in a randomized study, people that got that test were started on TB treatment 1 day earlier, and the 1 day earlier meant that they had a better chance of surviving. The reason I'm mentioning it here is that it's a good example of a tool that works and that is life-saving and is affordable that there's been almost no uptake of. And so another question or quandary that haunts our field is when we do get something new and good, like LAM or even like bedaquiline for the first 3 years, it's not used. It's like people are afraid in the TB community to use new tools. And to some extent, that wasn't really true of GeneXpert because there was a lot of push behind the rollout, but GeneXpert is not perfect from the point of view of a point of care test, and it was mostly placed in district headquarters around South Africa, for example. And so it wasn't close enough to the patient to be used as a true point of care test. Now that said, I think there's going to be some new platforms coming along that are going to use the GeneXpert technology that will be more accessible, more mobile, and more able to get out in the community where molecular diagnosis is needed. And I also think that we're going to need to have a more mobile form of molecular diagnosis because we're also going to need to use it for drug susceptibility testing. So in 2016, the phase 3 trial of bedaquiline was finally launched by USAID. And then last year, in another regimen-related move, the WHO endorsed the modified Bangladesh regimen, which I have to say, given the amount of scientific data about it from well-controlled randomized studies that were done under good clinical practice, kind of surprised some of us because, well, it just wasn't very, the data wasn't really very compelling, and it wasn't really data that was developed to a stringent regulatory authority standard, and if those data had gone to the HIV department, that regimen would have never made it through. But maybe they thought, well, it's going to be a long time before we get these results from these phase 3 studies, so we might as well do something. And the current standard of care, with quote marks, because it's never been validated, the 24-month standard of care for MDR-TB sucked. So maybe they thought, well, let's just try this 9-month regimen. It can't hurt, right? People might be more adherent to it because it's only 9 months long. But like I said, it didn't really meet what I would consider to be a stringent regulatory standard. And it reminds me of an era of desperation in the late 90s that happened in the HIV space, where there was a lot of people that had become multi-drug resistant to HIV compounds because they had started on an AZT-like nucleoside analog, and then when protease inhibitors came out, they added that, and then they became resistant to the nukes and to the protease inhibitors, so then their doctor switched them to an NNRTI, and they weren't getting 3 new drugs to which they didn't have pre-existing resistance. And so they were already 3-class resistant, and it was the end of the 90s, and it wasn't clear yet that we were going to get new drugs that would overcome that resistance or that would be from new classes. And so a French researcher invented this thing called GigaHeart, and GigaHeart was like 7 or 9 sort of randomly chosen anti-HIV drugs. And the problem with that was that, I mean, not only was it not based on any science, and sometimes they were giving 2 drugs from the same class that had the exact same target but didn't have any synergy because they competed for the target. So in that case, you would really just get overlapping toxicity. Luckily, new compounds came along in the 2000s, and we didn't have to keep working on GigaHeart, and it was never recommended by WHO, which I might also point out in the late 90s didn't have an HIV program and didn't have any HIV guidelines, needless to say. So another thing that was launched last year was the 3Ps initiative, which is an innovative approach that was originally proposed by MSF and is now being worked on by MSF and the union and others, which attempts to use kind of innovative funding mechanisms to drive the critical path forward for TB products. What I think is needed in that initiative is the resources to actually show whether or not it's going to work. And because of the resource problem I already mentioned, we have to think about where those resources are going to come from and whether or not they are going to be from the traditional funders or from new funders. And to that end, it's also been promising to notice that there have been some new funders coming into the space, like Unitate, which is funding the NTB study, which is more of a kind of an implementation science study of some of the newer TB drugs in programmatic settings. And then earlier this year, in spite of a welter of new data on the safety of bedaquiline when used in programmatic settings, particularly in South Africa, the WHO went to the expense of having a whole guidance meeting and talking about it and putting out a meeting report, but declined to actually update the bedaquiline recommendations because they said there wasn't enough new data. just want to point out that contradicts what they did last year with the modified Bangladesh regimen. But anyway, we hope that they will update the problem is that their bedaquiline recommendation is very conditional based on the phase 2 study where there was an excess of deaths in one arm that was probably due to a statistical blip. And so there's been a reluctance to use bedaquiline in the field, although it's indicated for multi-drug resistant TB. It's mostly only used for pre-XDR, XDR-TB. And so that means that one of our biggest new innovative compounds is not being used to its greatest potential. And that means that people are suffering and dying because they're not getting it. And that means that we're failing as a field because of our conservatism and our unwillingness to look at data. I mean, the safety data was from a very small phase 2 study that was really underpowered, and now it's been used in hundreds of people in South Africa, and they're not dropping dead of QTc prolongations, and the drug appears to be safe. And then this year, we finally have a regimen that includes a new drug, a kind of new drug, and a very new drug that's being used in XDR-TB, and it's actually saving lives. And that is the NICS-TB, uncontrolled NICS-TB study, which is I would call it a fairly early phase study that's uncontrolled and using individuals with XDR-TB, but it's using a 3-drug regimen for a standard treatment of 6 months. And in many of those individuals don't even take one of the drugs for the whole 6 months, but maybe only for 2 months or until they get a dose-limiting toxicity. And that regimen is a bedaquiline, pretomanid, and linezolid regimen, and you'll hear about the results. But the takeaway is that the combination seems to be working in the great majority of individuals that are taking it without having to go off drug prematurely. And the people that, there were some deaths early on that had to do with people that were very ill when they entered the study, but most of the people have been able to finish the study, and most of the people have been able to be followed out without having a relapse or a reinfection. And we're talking about a disease that in most previous historical experiences has been treated unsuccessfully in over 70% of patients. And so I think the NICS-TB trial results are kind of giving us a hint of what's possible with new regimen development. But they also raise some questions that I think this group needs to address and that I don't really think that we're fully ready to address. So what will the regulatory filing look like for this regimen? Will there be enough data? Is it enough to approve an indication for XDR-TB based on historical controls, which are so terrible? So I decided to look up the final results from Cliff Berry's study of linezolid in Seoul, and they were published in the New England Journal a couple years ago. And well, in that study, there was like a 71% treatment success rate. So this isn't the only time that we've seen good results from an XDR trial, and it may be that in the linezolid study that was done in South Korea, it may have been that people were not actually on the full background regimen until they were hospitalized to take the linezolid, and so then they received a combination regimen. But in any case, the results were a lot better than I had remembered them as being when I read the earlier results of the paper. And so it reminded me, well, what is the kind of, should there be a control arm, or how are the regulators going to handle this? And would it be acceptable to do a control arm? And it reminded me of the debates we used to have in the 80s about ganciclovir for CMV retinitis, which was one of the most common opportunistic infections with people with advanced HIV. And that was a drug that had been around for several years and had been in expanded access for over 7,000 patients, but there was no randomized data, and so the FDA and NIH wanted to do a study where they were going to take people with AIDS that had a condition that they called non-immediately sight-threatening retinitis and enroll them to immediate or deferred ganciclovir. And we were ACT UP, and we were young, and we were naive, and we were arrogant, and we were hopeful, and we were desperate. And so we demanded that the FDA and the NIH not do that study and that they approve the drug without a control arm. And it was a pretty unusual decision, but like I said, they had safety data on thousands of patients. There was no control arm. And it did look like the people that got ganciclovir didn't go blind, and that the ones that didn't get it did go blind. And so we do have an example from the HIV field of an effective drug that was approved without a control arm. I'm not saying that that's the path we should use with NICs. But I do think we need to think about how the regulatory filing is going to look. Other issues that have never come up in the TB space, what does expanded access to a new regimen look like? I mean, a clinician might be able to get access to linezolid or to bedaquiline, but they're not going to be able to get access to pretomanid. They could take a wild-ass guess and say, well, dilaminid is in the same class, so maybe we'll get dilaminid. But we haven't really thought through how we're going to do expanded access for a new regimen when the sponsors of one of the agents is a product development partnership that doesn't have the kind of funding that R&D-based pharma has for expanded access, which for them is actually kind of a early form of marketing, because it's a way of getting your medication into doctor's office in a more routine programmatic setting rather than in a clinical trial. So I think this group needs to think about these issues. The funding and the mechanism for funding these activities as part of a development package are not yet clear, and yet if the results are as compelling as they look now, I would expect there to be demand. Certainly if I was affected by MDR-TB, I would want to have a chance to take the all-oral, safe-looking, much more curative regimen. And as Francesca Conradi, who's one of the PIs in that study, says, I'm much more frightened of an aminoglycoside that could make me lose my hearing than I am of bedaquiline. So I'm going to leave you with a bunch of sort of downer thoughts that we need to think about. We don't have enough new molecules. We don't have enough private sector sponsors, new and old. I might add, we also don't have enough philanthropic section sponsors, and the public sponsors we have, like the NIH, are very threatened right now. We don't have money to rapidly develop compounds once they show promise. I'll never forget being at the KRIF opening in Durban in 2012 when Jacques Gosset from then at Hopkins showed me his mouse data on clofazimine when used in combination, and it looked really exciting. And now it's 2017, and we have an ACTG study of clofazimine that's slowly moving forward, but it's taken 5 years to move from the mouse data to that combination, and I think that's too long. And certainly in the HIV space, we would say that was too long. And oftentimes, we've had phase 2 compounds that have been left high and dry without a phase 3 study. And I'm not just mentioning bedaquiline, which is actually on the market in some places, but sutazolid is another example. And I want to call out the role of the priority review voucher, which was intended to help for the development of neglected diseases like tuberculosis. In my view, and the priority review voucher is something that you can trade for the right to get priority review on a drug you actually think you're going to make money on. And they're thought to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So I contend that the priority review voucher has actually slowed down TB R&D because the squabble over who gets the priority review voucher for it, whether it's Pfizer or Sequela or who else, has meant that it's been harder for them to decide how to actually move the fucking compound forward into phase 3. And so we've had this promising compound up there since the first TAG pipeline report that I mentioned earlier, and we don't know any more about it than we knew in 2012, or when Pfizer passed it over to a company that didn't have any resources to develop it, which is Sequela. And so I would contend the priority review voucher is not meeting its goal and actually should be abolished. But I think there's a lot of other parts of the FDA that are more likely to be abolished under the current administration than the priority review voucher. We've seen some real progress on molecular drug susceptibility testing, but it's still not available in the field for all relevant compounds, particularly PZA. And we still need to develop phenotypic DST for some of the newer compounds that isn't yet standardized, like bedaquiline and dilaminid and pretomanid. But above it all, I think we need a more dynamic and exciting vision for what we're going to be able to accomplish with TB drug development. And that goes back again to the results from NICs, but I also think there's going to be some other exciting results from some other combo earlier phase studies that could drive a lot of innovation in this space. And maybe the time for the CPTR to really sort of accelerate what it's doing is going to arrive, because we're going to have several new regimens that are going to need to be advanced. And I hope we can avoid some of the mistakes that have been made. I welcome the involvement of TB survivors in this meeting. I think that those voices are really important and need to be included. I think we need better alignment within partners, not only between partners, but even within them. Recent example is the WHO with great fanfare announced that there was 12 priority drug-resistant pathogens that were going to run around the world with drug-resistant disease and kill millions of people, and we needed new compounds for them and blah, 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 and they forgot to include tuberculosis. And then they lamely said, well, MDR-TB already has a lot of investment. You know, it's got a ton of investment. There's a program, we've been talking about it for years. We really wanted to bring attention to these other, and then I looked at the compounds and I looked at the pathogens, and I was like, what they don't realize is that they really need a series of new classes of antibiotics, which are in common between these different resistant organisms. And MDR falls right in the middle of it, because quinolones were one of the classes which resistance was a big problem to. And I thought, God, you know, this is so typical of some of our multilaterals in the current era, where you do an own goal. You know, you had an opportunity to promote a sort of unified antimicrobial resistance development plan, and instead you put the neglected pathogens over there and TB over there. And so TB, again, is sort of like doubly neglected. It's too prominent to be included in the neglected list, but it's too neglected to be in the prominent list. And so it suffers from under-alignment, poor investment, and this is an example of an organization that actually can help alleviate those things, but not alone. And so I don't know whether there's any hope. I don't know whether the upcoming TB ministerial meeting that's in Moscow in November, or the UNGAS, the meeting next year that the UN General Assembly is going to have on TB, or they must be opportunities for us to advance and to gain more political will and investment that we need. I'm really impressed that the TB field has done a lot with a little. Just think how much we could do if we had a lot, or at least a lot more. Thanks for letting me share with you my reflections. Thanks again to the Critical Path, and thanks again to Jan Goens for his visionary leadership at the Gates Foundation TB program.